The crystal chandeliers cast warm, golden light across the grand ballroom of Blackwood Estate, where laughter, champagne, and polite conversation blended into the perfect image of elegance. Influential politicians, renowned philanthropists, celebrated entrepreneurs, and society's elite gathered beneath the towering ceilings for the annual charity gala, an event dedicated to generosity and compassion. Yet beneath the polished marble floors and glittering decorations, kindness had quietly disappeared. A sharp crack shattered the music. The sound of a riding whip slicing through the air echoed against the walls, silencing every conversation in an instant. Ivy Lancaster staggered forward as the leather struck her shoulder, the force tearing the sleeve of her simple maid's uniform. She instinctively bit down on her lip to stop herself from crying out. A thin red line quickly appeared across her skin, burning beneath the fabric. Crystal glasses froze halfway to waiting lips. Conversations died without warning, and dozens of distinguished guests watched the scene unfold in stunned silence. No one moved. No one objected. Some lowered their eyes, pretending not to see. Others remained perfectly still, unwilling to challenge the woman standing at the center of the room. Vivian Hale lowered the antique riding whip with effortless confidence. Dressed in an exquisite silk evening gown, adorned with priceless diamonds, she looked every bit the picture of sophistication. Her flawless appearance only made the cruelty in her expression more unsettling. She glanced at the stain on her designer glove before looking back at Ivy with cold satisfaction. "Perhaps pain will finally teach you where you belong," she said, her voice smooth enough to sound almost pleasant. A servant should remember her place. Without waiting for a response, Vivian lifted the whip again. Before the leather could descend, another hand closed firmly around it. The movement was calm, almost effortless, yet it carried enough authority to stop the entire room. "Touch her again," a deep voice said quietly, "and you'll leave this house with nothing." Vivian smiled automatically, convinced that whoever dared interrupt her simply failed to understand who she was. Then she turned around. The smile disappeared. Standing before her was Ronan Blackwood. For one suspended heartbeat, the ballroom seemed to stop breathing. He wore a simple charcoal suit without extravagant jewelry or obvious displays of wealth. But none were necessary. His presence alone transformed the atmosphere. Executives who negotiated billion-dollar deals lowered their eyes. Politicians suddenly found the marble floor fascinating. Even the string quartet allowed the final trembling note to fade into complete silence. Power did not announce itself with raised voices. Sometimes it entered a room so quietly that everyone recognized it before a single word was spoken. Ronan released the whip without another glance at Vivian. The leather slipped from her hand and landed softly on the polished floor. He ignored the weapon entirely and turned toward the young woman standing before him. Ivy remained perfectly still. Her uniform had been torn where the whip struck, exposing the beginning of another darkening bruise across her shoulder. Her hands were folded together in front of her as though she were trying to make herself invisible. She had not begged for mercy. She had not argued. She simply endured the humiliation while dozens of strangers watched. For a brief moment, Ronan studied her injuries without saying a word. Then he quietly removed his tailored suit jacket. Every eye in the ballroom followed the movement. Instead of draping it over his own fiancée or offering some dramatic display of anger, he gently placed the expensive jacket across Ivy's shoulders, carefully covering the torn fabric of her uniform. The gesture was simple, respectful, and unexpectedly gentle. "You shouldn't be cold," he said, startled. Ivy looked up at him. "Sir, I'm fine. I wasn't asking." His voice remained calm, yet the quiet certainty behind those words carried more weight than any shout could have. Ivy lowered her gaze, not because she felt ashamed, but because she had never experienced such kindness from someone in a position of authority. Throughout years of working countless difficult jobs, employers had demanded perfection. Never compassion, Ronan's concern confused her more than the pain itself. Only after making certain she was covered did he finally turn toward the crowd. His expression revealed nothing. He slowly scanned the ballroom, meeting one pair of eyes after another, until the silence became almost unbearable. "Who?" he asked evenly. "Gave permission for this?" The question drifted through the room like a cold winter wind. No one answered. Executives exchanged nervous glances. A senator quietly cleared his throat. Several investors suddenly became fascinated by the champagne in their glasses. Even longtime family friends avoided Ronan's gaze. Every person present had witnessed the assault, yet not one possessed the courage to speak. Vivian recovered first. She offered the graceful smile that had charmed magazine photographers and charity committees for years before stepping closer, as though the incident had been nothing more than an unfortunate misunderstanding. "Darling," she said lightly, "you're making this much more dramatic than it needs to be." The maid was careless. "She stained my glove in front of everyone." A little discipline was necessary. Ronan repeated a single word. "Discipline." Vivian nodded confidently. "Staff members must understand standards. If servants aren't corrected, they become careless." I simply reminded her of her responsibilities. A few uneasy smiles appeared among the guests, each one silently hoping the explanation would bring the uncomfortable scene to an end. It did not. Ronan's gaze swept across the ballroom once again. His silence lasted only seconds, yet it felt far longer. Those who had negotiated international mergers and political alliances suddenly felt like children waiting outside a principal's office. Near the entrance stood Malcolm Reeves, the Blackwood family's longtime butler who had served 3 generations of the estate. He had seen Ronan angry only a handful of times during decades of service. What unsettled him now was not anger. It was restraint. Finally, Ronan spoke again. "I asked who gave permission." Once more. No answer came. Vivian's elegant smile began to tighten. "This is my charity reception," she insisted. "I organized every detail. Maintaining order is my responsibility. Our guests don't need to witness unnecessary conflict." "Our guests." Ronan repeated the words with quiet disbelief, allowing them to hang in the air. Without another comment, he bent down and picked up the antique riding whip from the marble floor. Several guests instinctively held their breath. Instead of reacting with fury, Ronan calmly examined the aged leather. "This belonged to my grandfather," he said. "It was displayed to honor the history of this estate." His eyes slowly lifted. "It was never meant to become a weapon." He extended the whip toward Malcolm. "Lock it away." The elderly butler accepted it immediately. "Yes, Mr. Blackwood." The formal title carried unmistakable significance. It reminded everyone present that beneath the glamour of the evening, there was only one person whose authority truly mattered. Ronan returned his attention to Ivy. "You'll have your injuries examined." She instinctively shook her head. "They're only scratches." "They still matter." There was no pity in his voice, only quiet certainty. Then he turned once more to face the silent ballroom. "The reception will continue." A brief pause followed, but before this evening ends, his steady gaze moved slowly across every guest. "The truth of what happened here will be known." No one questioned him. What had begun as Vivian Hale's carefully orchestrated charity gala had, within a matter of minutes, to become something entirely different. A silent courtroom where power no longer belonged to wealth, appearances, or social influence, but to truth itself. As cautious conversations gradually returned and the musicians reluctantly resumed their performance, one certainty settled over Blackwood Estate. Before the night was over, someone's carefully constructed world was going to collapse. The physician had barely finished wrapping the thin bandage around Ivy Lancaster's shoulder when a timid knock echoed through the sitting room. A young catering assistant stepped inside, her hands trembling so violently that she nearly dropped the serving tray. She still clutched against her chest. Tears streamed down her face before she could speak. I'm so sorry, she whispered through broken sobs. This happened because of me. Ronan looked at her with quiet curiosity. What do you mean? The young woman lowered her head, ashamed even to meet his eyes. I slipped while carrying the soup. It almost fell onto a little boy standing beside his mother. Miss Lancaster caught the bowl before it burned him. Only a few drops landed on Miss Hale's glove. She paused, struggling to steady her breathing. Everyone thought Ivy had made the mistake because she told them it was her fault. Silence settled over the room. Ronan slowly turned toward Ivy. You accepted the blame. She looked genuinely surprised that the decision required an explanation. The child wasn't hurt, she answered softly. If everyone believed the assistant had been responsible, she would have lost her job. I could replace a uniform. She couldn't replace her livelihood. The young employee suddenly dropped to her knees. I should have told the truth. Before anyone else could react, Ivy gently helped her back to her feet. No, she said with a reassuring smile. We don't kneel to apologize. We learn. We improve. And next time we do better. She carefully straightened the girl's crooked apron before adding with a playful grin. Carry the soup with both hands from now on. The nervous assistant laughed through her tears and nodded repeatedly. I promise. For the first time that evening, Ronan found himself looking at Ivy differently. She had every reason to defend herself. Yet she had instinctively protected someone more vulnerable than herself, without expecting gratitude or recognition. There had been no calculation behind her choice. Compassion had simply come naturally to her. Moments later, while the physician packed away his medical supplies, Ivy glanced anxiously toward the kitchen entrance. What time does the dessert auction begin? She asked. Malcolm blinked in confusion. My dear, you've just been injured. I know. The doctor hasn't even finished examining you. She smiled apologetically. The chocolate soufflés need to come out of the ovens soon. If they stay inside much longer, they'll collapse. The citrus tarts still need another few minutes before the fruit is added. Otherwise, they'll become soggy. Everyone in the room stared at her in disbelief. You were whipped, the physician reminded her, and several hundred people donated generously tonight. Ivy replied gently. It would be a shame if all that effort ended with disappointing desserts. Without waiting for permission, she hurried toward the kitchens, unable to explain why. Ronan quietly followed, behind the elegant ballroom. Organized chaos had replaced celebration. Chefs rushed between ovens. Servers whispered nervously. And junior employees stood frozen, terrified that one mistake would ruin the evening. The moment Ivy entered, relief spread across the room. Miss Ivy, the caramel is crystallizing. The auction trays aren't finished. We're running out of garnish. She clapped her hands once. Not loudly, but confidently enough to capture everyone's attention. Take a deep breath, she said with calm certainty. Lower the temperature on oven 3. Don't throw away the caramel. Add warm cream slowly and it'll smooth out. Emily, decorate the cheesecakes after slicing them. Michael. She looked toward one visibly panicked pastry chef and smiled. The guests can't taste your fear, so stop seasoning the food with it. Soft laughter rippled across the kitchen. Within minutes, the tension disappeared. People moved with confidence again, following her instructions naturally. She never shouted. She never blamed anyone. Somehow, simply by remaining calm herself, she restored order to an entire team on the verge of collapse, standing unnoticed in the doorway. Ronan watched every interaction. No one obeyed Ivy because she possessed authority. They listened because they trusted her. One exhausted pastry chef sighed with visible relief. I honestly don't know what we'd do without you. Ivy chuckled while adjusting a tray of desserts. You'd survive, she teased. You'd simply serve slightly overcooked soufflés. The kitchen erupted with laughter. Even Ronan found himself smiling. It was brief, almost imperceptible, yet entirely genuine. He had expected to find a hard-working housemaid. Instead, he had discovered someone quietly leading an entire department without a title, without recognition, and without ever asking for either. That evening refused to leave his thoughts. Long after the final guests had departed, he remained inside his private study overlooking the rain-covered gardens, while untouched financial reports sat forgotten across his desk. Only one question occupied his mind. Who exactly is Ivy Lancaster? Malcolm Reeves entered carrying 2 cups of black tea. As though he had anticipated the question hours earlier, I wondered how long it would take before you asked. The elderly butler said with a knowing smile. Ronan leaned back quietly. Tell me. Malcolm folded his hands before beginning. Most people assume Miss Lancaster became a housemaid because she lacked ambition. He shook his head. The opposite is true. He explained that Ivy had graduated at the top of her university with highest honors in hospitality management. Professors believed she would eventually oversee one of the world's finest luxury hotels. Her future had seemed limitless until her father's logistics company collapsed after being betrayed by trusted business partners. They lost everything. Malcolm continued quietly. Their home. Their savings. Every investment they had spent decades building. Ronan listened without interruption. She could have declared bankruptcy like everyone advised. Instead, she chose to repay every creditor herself. One debt at a time. Why? Because she believed her father's name deserved better than being remembered as unpaid promises. Ronan frowned thoughtfully. With her qualifications, why didn't she accept a management position somewhere else? Malcolm smiled sadly. She tried. For nearly a year, she attended interview after interview. Every employer admired her education but asked the same questions. Where is your experience? Who can recommend you? What influential connections do you have? When debt destroys a family, it often destroys opportunity as well. The estate offered temporary work, so she accepted it. And she never mentioned any of this. There was no reason to. Malcolm looked toward the rain beyond the windows. She believes dignity isn't something other people hand to you. It's something you choose to keep. He then shared another story. During Ivy's 3rd week at the estate, a newly hired employee accidentally shattered an antique vase while cleaning. Terrified of losing his job, the young man secretly tried to hide the pieces. Before anyone else discovered the accident, Ivy quietly used an entire week's wages to replace the vase herself. When he tried to repay her, Malcolm recalled with a warm smile. She refused. What did she say? If you truly want to repay me, help someone else when they need it. The stories continued. She often bought lunch for junior staff members who skipped meals to save money. She stayed late to help exhausted housekeepers finish impossible workloads. She repaired uniforms rather than allowing embarrassed employees to be criticized for torn sleeves. When gardeners struggled with heavy equipment, she carried it without being asked. Whenever someone cried after a difficult day, Ivy somehow managed to make everyone laugh before her own shift ended. She never sought recognition. She simply believed difficult days became easier when people faced them together. The following morning, Ronan found himself asking Malcolm an unexpected question. How is Miss Lancaster today? The words surprised even him. Malcolm smiled knowingly before answering. She has already been helping the gardeners since sunrise. From the library balcony above, another pair of eyes witnessed the brief exchange. Vivian Hale. She watched as Ronan looked across the courtyard toward Ivy, who had paused to help an elderly gardener lift a heavy stone planter before continuing on her way, carrying fresh flowers for the guest suites. The gardener laughed. The nearby housekeepers smiled. Even Malcolm seemed unusually fond of her. Vivian tightened her grip around the delicate porcelain teacup in her hands. She couldn't understand it. Ivy possessed no wealth, no influential surname, no elegant wardrobe. Yet wherever she walked, people relaxed. They smiled. They trusted her. Most troubling of all, Ronan had begun noticing her. Not with romance. Not yet. With something Vivian recognized immediately. Respect. and she knew better than anyone that genuine respect often became something far more dangerous than admiration. For the first time since entering Blackwood Estate, uncertainty settled into Vivian's carefully controlled heart. She had never feared a servant before. Now she realized Ivy Lancaster might become the only rival she could never defeat with money, status, or appearances alone. The change began quietly. Vivian Hale had built her entire life on understanding people. She could recognize insecurity hidden beneath confidence, ambition concealed behind humility, and weakness disguised as politeness. Those instincts had earned her influential friendships, lucrative business partnerships, magazine covers, and eventually an engagement ring carrying the Blackwood family name. She had always believed that people were predictable once you understood what they wanted, but Ivy Lancaster refused to fit into any pattern she recognized. Over the following days, Vivian noticed subtle changes throughout Blackwood Estate. Ronan no longer asked Malcolm only about financial reports, renovation schedules, or upcoming business meetings. Every so often, almost casually, he would ask, "Has Miss Lancaster fully recovered? Or how is the staff managing today?" The questions were brief. They should have meant nothing. To Vivian, they meant everything. One afternoon, she stood on the library balcony overlooking the courtyard below. Ivy crossed the stone pathway carrying fresh flowers for the guest suites when she noticed one of the elderly gardeners struggling to move a heavy planter. Without hesitation, she placed the flowers aside and helped him lift it. They exchanged a few cheerful words before Ivy continued on her way. Smiling as though losing several minutes of her own time carried no importance. Nearby housekeepers greeted her warmly. Kitchen staff waved as she passed. Even Malcolm, whose reserved nature rarely allowed emotional attachment, spoke to her with unmistakable affection. Vivian tightened her grip around the porcelain teacup in her hand. Why did everyone seem happier whenever that woman appeared? She possessed no fortune, no influential family, no elegant title, yet she somehow attracted loyalty without asking for it. Most unsettling of all, Ronan had begun paying attention. Not with desire. Not yet. With respect. Vivian understood better than anyone that genuine respect often became the foundation of something far stronger than attraction. She refused to allow that possibility to grow. The following evening, several wealthy investors and prominent social figures remained at the estate after a private business dinner. Among them were journalists, charity board members, and the editor of one of the country's most respected luxury magazines. Vivian recognized an opportunity. She approached the group with an expression of reluctant concern. "I probably shouldn't mention this," she began softly. "But every large household eventually has one employee who learns how to become everyone's favorite." The guests exchanged curious glances. "What do you mean?" Vivian sighed gently, as though uncomfortable with the conversation. "Miss Lancaster has an extraordinary talent. She always seems to find herself at the center of sympathy whenever influential visitors are present." One woman frowned thoughtfully. "She doesn't strike me as manipulative." Vivian smiled sympathetically. "Appearances can be wonderfully convincing." She leaned slightly closer. "I've seen women build comfortable lives simply by making powerful men feel protective. Kindness can be surprisingly strategic." She never directly accused Ivy of dishonesty. She didn't need to. Suggestions traveled farther than accusations ever could. Within hours, whispers drifted through the corridors. Some guests quietly questioned whether Ivy had exaggerated her injuries. Others wondered whether saving the child had been staged. Someone claimed she intentionally attracted Ronan's attention. Each retelling added another layer of suspicion. Each conversation moved farther from the truth. By the following afternoon, the rumors had spread throughout nearly every corner of Blackwood Estate. Ivy noticed immediately. Conversations ended whenever she entered a room. Smiles disappeared. Guests who had once thanked her for excellent service now regarded her with guarded expressions. A young server approached her nervously inside the linen room. "They're saying terrible things about you." "I know. Doesn't it upset you?" For a brief moment, Ivy looked through the nearby window where soft rain drifted across the gardens. Then she smiled. The truth doesn't become weaker simply because someone whispers louder. The young employee remained silent. If I spend my time chasing every lie, Ivy continued gently, I'll have no time left to live, honestly. She returned to folding fresh table linens as though nothing had happened. Across the corridor, Ronan witnessed the entire exchange. He noticed something remarkable. Ivy never defended herself, not because she lacked courage, because she believed character endured longer than gossip. For reasons he could not fully explain, he believed she was right. 3 days after the charity reception, Blackwood Estate appeared to have returned to normal. Business meetings resumed. Guests continued arriving. Employees carried out their responsibilities with practiced precision. Only Ronan understood that appearances often concealed unfinished truths. He had never made important decisions while angry. He preferred evidence. Late that afternoon, he quietly entered the estate's security office. The technicians immediately stood. Mr. Blackwood, I need every recording from the night of the charity reception. Minutes later, multiple surveillance screens illuminated the dark room. The footage began hours before the incident. Ronan watched patiently. Guests arrived. Musicians rehearsed. Servers carried silver trays through the ballroom. Then Ivy appeared. She adjusted chairs for elderly donors before they asked for assistance. She returned a lost toy to a frightened child. She directed confused volunteers toward the correct entrance. Every action reflected quiet competence. No audience. No expectation of praise. Only kindness. The recording continued. A young catering assistant emerged carrying a large bowl of steaming soup. The polished floor beneath her shoes glistened. She slipped. The bowl lurched toward a little boy standing beside his mother. Before anyone else reacted, Ivy stepped forward. She caught most of the bowl with her bare hands, shielding the child from the boiling liquid. Only a few drops splashed onto Vivian's designer glove. The little boy remained unharmed. The assistant stayed standing. Then the moment arrived that changed everything. Vivian slowly looked down at her glove. She glanced around the ballroom. Without hesitation, she walked toward the antique display cabinet. She removed the decorative riding whip, turned around, and struck Ivy. Once. The footage continued. Ivy lowered her head without resisting. Vivian struck her again. There was no confusion, no panic, no loss of control, only deliberate cruelty. The room inside the security office fell completely silent. One technician quietly whispered, I never realized it looked like that. Ronan never looked away from the screen. It looked exactly like that. He stood. Invite every remaining guest. Investor, journalist, and staff member to the ballroom. An hour later, the crystal chandeliers illuminated the same magnificent hall where everything had begun. Only the atmosphere had changed. Guests gathered in uneasy silence. Journalists opened their notebooks. Employees stood together near the rear entrance. Vivian entered confidently, believing another charitable announcement would be made. She smiled politely at several reporters. Then she noticed the enormous projection screen waiting at the front of the ballroom. Her confidence faltered. Ronan stood beside it, his expression calm and unreadable. Ladies and gentlemen, he began evenly. There has been considerable discussion regarding the events that occurred during our recent reception. He paused. I believe discussion should end where evidence begins. The lights dimmed. The recording played without narration, without dramatic music, without commentary. Only truth. The ballroom watched Ivy protect the child. They watched her shield the frightened assistant. They watched Vivian deliberately retrieve the riding whip. They watched the first strike. Then the second. Silence settled over every corner of the room. No explanation remained possible. When the lights returned, several guests lowered their eyes in visible shame. Vivian stepped forward, her composure beginning to crack. Ronan, this proves nothing. She embarrassed us in front of everyone. I was maintaining discipline. He regarded her quietly. You've repeated that explanation several times. His voice remained perfectly calm. It has never become true. You can't humiliate me like this. I built relationships for your family. I stood beside your name. I sacrificed years of my life. You sought the influence of my name, Ronan answered softly, but never the responsibility that came with it. For the first time, genuine fear appeared in Vivian's eyes. She searched desperately around the ballroom. Not one guest spoke in her defense. Not one investor supported her. Not even her closest social companions moved. The evidence had left no room for loyalty built upon convenience. Ronan reached into his pocket. He removed the engagement ring he had carried since returning to the estate. Without ceremony, without anger, he placed it gently upon the nearest table. A woman who humiliates the innocent, he said quietly, will never become part of my family. The words echoed through the silent ballroom. There was no shouting, no revenge, only finality. Vivian's face drained of color as the future she had spent years constructing collapsed before hundreds of witnesses. Across the room, Ivy stood among the household staff. She had never demanded justice. She had never asked anyone to defend her. Yet justice had found her anyway. As silence settled over Blackwood Estate, everyone present understood a truth. No amount of wealth or influence could erase. Power may command obedience. Fear may command silence. But only character can command respect, and on that evening, every person in the ballroom knew exactly which kind of power would endure long after the applause had faded, 3 weeks after the engagement ended. Life at Blackwood Estate slowly settled into a peaceful rhythm. The constant tension that had once lingered in every corridor gradually disappeared. Laughter returned to the kitchens. Conversations among the staff became lighter, and no one flinched anymore at the sound of footsteps approaching from behind. For the first time in years, the estate no longer felt like a place where people worked out of fear. It had become a place where they worked with pride. For Ivy Lancaster, however, peace brought a difficult decision. Early one Monday morning, she stood alone inside the quiet laundry office, carefully folding the last of her neatly pressed uniforms. Beside them rested a simple white envelope containing a resignation letter she had rewritten countless times. The words were sincere, filled with gratitude rather than disappointment. Blackwood Estate had offered her honest work when few others had been willing to give her a chance. Her family's debts were almost completely repaid, and she believed it was finally time to begin searching for the future she had once imagined. More importantly, she did not want her presence to remain a reminder of the scandal that had ended Ronan's engagement. The estate deserved to move forward without people constantly connecting its new beginning to an old wound. As she stepped into the hallway, Malcolm Reeves approached with his familiar, gentle smile. "You look nervous," he observed. Ivy laughed softly. "I've faced much worse than delivering one letter." "I'm sure you have," Malcolm replied. "But somehow I think this one weighs more." Before she could answer, another employee hurried toward them. "Miss Lancaster. Mr. Blackwood would like to see you." A few minutes later, Ivy found herself standing outside Ronan's private office. She knocked quietly before entering. The room reflected its owner perfectly. Spacious yet understated. Elegant without unnecessary luxury. Bookshelves lined one wall, while large windows overlooked the autumn gardens glowing with shades of amber and gold. Ronan rose from behind his desk. His eyes immediately settled on the envelope in her hands. "I was told you wished to speak with me." She stepped forward and placed the letter on his desk. "I came to thank you. And to give you this?" He unfolded the first page. "Read only the opening sentence." Then calmly closed it again. "You're resigning. I believe it's the right time. You've accepted another position." She shook her head. "Not yet. I'll begin looking after I leave." For several quiet moments, neither of them spoke. Finally, Ronan slid the envelope back across the desk. "No." Ivy looked at him, confused. "I'm sorry. I won't accept your resignation." A faint smile appeared on her face. "I'm not asking for a raise. I wasn't planning to offer one." He walked toward the window before continuing. 3 weeks ago, I asked the executive board of the Blackwood Foundation to conduct a complete evaluation of every department under our charitable organization." She listened attentively. They concluded that our hospitality division required stronger leadership. He returned to the desk and placed a leather folder before her. They were correct. But they searched for the wrong person. Curious. Ivy opened the folder. Halfway down the first page, her breathing stopped. Director of Hospitality, Blackwood Foundation. She looked up immediately. There has to be some mistake. There isn't. I've spent the last several years cleaning guest rooms. You've spent the last several years leading people. His answer came without hesitation. I watched an entire kitchen regain confidence because you walked through the door. I watched frightened employees become calmer because you spoke to them. I watched people trust your judgment long before anyone gave you authority. She lowered the folder slowly. I'm only a maid. For the first time since they had met. Ronan smiled with complete sincerity. No. He shook his head gently. That's simply the uniform you've been wearing. The words reached somewhere deep inside her. For years. Ivy had measured herself according to the work she performed, instead of the person she had become. She had convinced herself that every dream she once carried had disappeared alongside her family's fortune. Now someone was asking her to believe otherwise. Not because he pitied her, because he believed in her. Tears gathered quietly in her eyes. I don't know if I'm capable. I do. Why? Ronan answered without taking his eyes off hers. Because leadership isn't measured by how many people obey you. It's measured by how many people become stronger because you were there. Silence filled the room. She remembered the frightened catering assistant, the exhausted pastry chefs, the gardeners, the young housekeepers. She had never considered those moments leadership. She had simply tried to help. I'll need time to think. You have all the time you need. As she reached the doorway, Ronan spoke once more. Miss Lancaster. She turned. No matter what you decide. Never allow anyone to convince you that your worth was ever defined by an apron. She left his office carrying the appointment folder against her chest. For the first time since losing everything, the future no longer felt like something she needed to survive. It felt like something she was finally allowed to build. A month later, Ivy accepted the position. Her transition into the new role surprised everyone except those who already knew her. She never allowed authority to change her character. She still greeted every employee by name each morning. When the kitchens became overwhelmed before a fundraising banquet, she rolled up her sleeves and carried serving trays herself. She thanked cleaners before greeting executives and listened to junior employees with the same attention she offered board members. Very quickly, respect followed naturally, not because of her title, because she had earned it long before receiving it. Working together became effortless for Ronan and Ivy. He negotiated with donors, community leaders, and corporate partners, while she transformed complicated plans into welcoming experiences that made every guest feel valued. Whenever unexpected problems appeared, they solved them side by side, exchanging ideas instead of giving orders. Their conversations gradually expanded beyond work. They spoke about books while reviewing charity proposals. They discussed childhood memories during long drives to foundation events. Sometimes they remained comfortably silent while walking through the estate gardens after particularly exhausting evenings. Nothing about their growing connection felt rushed. Neither of them searched for romance. They simply discovered how peaceful life could become in the company of someone who understood kindness as naturally as breathing. Several months later, during preparations for a children's literacy fundraiser, a sudden power outage plunged the venue into darkness. Only 2 hours before hundreds of guests were scheduled to arrive. Managers panicked. Employees argued. Decorations remained unfinished. Without hesitation, Ivy stepped into the center of the room. Everyone, look at me. Her voice remained calm. The generators will keep the kitchens running. Candles can replace decorative lighting. The children came here hoping for books. They won't remember whether every chandelier was shining. They'll remember whether we welcomed them with warmth. Almost immediately, confidence returned. People resumed working together. The evening became one of the Foundation's most successful charity events, standing quietly near the entrance. Ronan watched her inspire an entire room without raising her voice once. That night, after the final guests had departed, Ivy slipped away to the estate's reflecting pool, grateful for a few moments of silence beneath the autumn stars. She heard familiar footsteps approaching behind her. "I thought you might still be working," she said with a smile. "I decided the paperwork could wait." Ronan sat beside her. For several peaceful minutes, they watched moonlight ripple across the water without speaking. Finally, Ivy broke the silence. "May I ask you something?" "Anything." She hesitated. "Why did you trust me so quickly?" Ronan looked across the quiet pond before answering. "When I returned that evening, I thought I was simply stopping someone from being treated unfairly." A faint smile touched his face. "I didn't realize I was meeting someone extraordinary." She laughed softly. "I think you're giving me far too much credit." "I'm not." He turned toward her. "The security footage showed everyone what happened. But that wasn't what stayed with me. You stepped in front of a frightened child without thinking. You protected someone who couldn't protect herself. You accepted punishment without asking anyone to defend you." He paused. "The first person you chose to protect wasn't yourself. It was someone weaker." His voice remained quiet. "I've spent years surrounded by people who calculated every decision according to what they might gain. You acted before you even considered yourself. That can't be performed. That's simply who you are." Emotion filled Ivy's eyes. "I never thought anyone noticed." "I noticed. So did every person whose life became easier because you were there." Slowly, Ronan reached toward her hand. Not suddenly, not dramatically. Carefully enough that she could pull away if she wished. She didn't. Their fingers intertwined naturally beneath the cool evening sky. "Ivy," he said softly, "I don't admire you because you rescued one child. I admire you because compassion has always been the way you've chosen to live." He drew a quiet breath. "And if you'll allow me, I'd like to spend the rest of my life walking beside that kind of heart." For a long moment, Ivy searched his eyes. There was no pressure, no grand promise, no attempt to impress her with wealth or influence, only honesty. The same honesty that had slowly earned her trust. A bright, unguarded smile spread across her face. "I was hoping you'd say that." Ronan laughed quietly. It was the easiest, most genuine laugh he had known in years. Beneath the autumn stars, beside the still water of the reflecting pool, their love began exactly where everything else between them had begun, with respect, quiet understanding, and complete trust. 1 year passed more quickly than anyone at Blackwood Estate could have imagined. Autumn returned, painting the gardens with brilliant shades of amber, crimson, and gold. The marble entrance shimmered beneath crystal chandeliers once again as guests from across the country arrived for the annual Blackwood Foundation Charity Gala. Distinguished philanthropists, business leaders, journalists, educators, and community volunteers filled the estate with lively conversation. The decorations were as elegant as ever, the music just as graceful, and the generosity no less remarkable. Yet anyone who had attended the previous year's reception immediately sensed that something far more important had changed. The estate no longer felt intimidating. It felt welcoming. Long before the first guests stepped into the ballroom, Ivy Lancaster stood near the staff entrance rather than the grand staircase reserved for executives. Dressed in a tailored navy suit instead of a maid's uniform, she greeted every employee personally as they arrived. She thanked the gardeners for preparing the grounds before sunrise. She complimented the chefs on the menu they had spent weeks refining. She shook hands with the maintenance team who had worked through the night to ensure every light, every sound system, and every detail functioned perfectly. Most importantly, she greeted each member of the housekeeping staff by name, remembering birthdays, asking about families, and making certain everyone had eaten before the evening became busy. Nothing about her success had changed the way she treated people. If anything, responsibility had simply given her more opportunities to care for them. Near the end of the preparation, a young housemaid approached nervously, clutching a silver serving tray with both hands. "Miss Lancaster," she whispered, "this is my first formal reception. I've never served guests like this before. I'm afraid I'll make a mistake. Ivy smiled with the same quiet warmth that had comforted countless people over the years. Then you'll fit in perfectly. The young woman blinked in confusion. I made mistakes during my first reception, too. You did. More than I'd like to admit. The housemaid laughed softly. The important part isn't avoiding mistakes. It's learning from them without losing confidence. The fear slowly disappeared from the young employee's face. Across the entrance hall, Ronan Blackwood watched the conversation with quiet pride. He no longer saw the frightened young woman he had protected 1 year earlier. He saw the leader she had always been. The evening unfolded beautifully. Charitable donations exceeded expectations. Volunteers worked together effortlessly. Guests repeatedly praised not only the flawless organization but also the atmosphere of genuine warmth that seemed to surround every corner of the estate. Several longtime donors quietly remarked that they had never attended a formal event that felt so personal despite its impressive scale. For Ivy, that compliment mattered more than any amount of money raised. As dessert was being served, an unexpected sound echoed across the ballroom. Crash. A young housemaid accidentally caught the corner of a tablecloth while carrying a silver tray. Porcelain dessert plates shattered across the polished marble floor. The room fell silent. For a brief moment, the young employee stood completely frozen. Her face turned pale. Tears immediately filled her eyes. I'm so sorry. I'll pay for everything. 1 year earlier, everyone in the ballroom knew exactly what would have happened. Someone would have been humiliated. Someone would have been blamed. Fear would have silenced every witness. Instead, Ivy calmly walked toward the frightened girl. Without the slightest hesitation, she knelt beside the broken pieces, carefully gathering them before anyone could accidentally step on the sharp porcelain. Then she looked up. Her first question was not about the expensive dishes, not about the mistake, not about responsibility. Are you hurt? The young woman shook her head, unable to speak. No. A gentle smile appeared on Ivy's face. Then the most important problem has already been solved. The words seemed to release the entire room from its silence. Several nearby guests immediately stepped forward to help collect the remaining pieces. A chef brought a broom. Another server carried fresh dessert plates from the kitchen. Within moments, the accident had become nothing more than a brief interruption rather than a public humiliation. The young employee stared around the ballroom in disbelief. No one blamed her. No one shouted. No one demanded punishment. Instead, complete strangers smiled reassuringly as they helped restore order. Standing nearby, Malcolm Reeves quietly watched the scene with misty eyes. A year ago, another young woman had stood in almost the same place after accepting punishment for protecting someone else. Now compassion had replaced fear so completely that no one even considered cruelty as an option. The transformation reached far beyond one evening. It had become part of the estate itself. As the gala continued, a journalist who had attended the previous year's reception approached Ronan. I've reported on events at Blackwood Estate for many years, he said thoughtfully. This place feels completely different now. Ronan glanced across the ballroom. He saw chefs laughing while serving desserts, housekeepers chatting comfortably with guests, volunteers working beside executives without hesitation. He saw Ivy helping the nervous housemaid carry a fresh tray before quietly returning to welcome another group of donors. The reporter smiled. What changed this house? Ronan never looked away from Ivy. His answer came without hesitation. The day kindness replaced fear. The journalist slowly lowered his notebook. No further explanation seemed necessary. Those 5 words described far more than a building. They described an entire culture. The music resumed. Conversations filled the ballroom once again. Children laughed near the donation displays while volunteers celebrated another successful fundraising campaign. The applause that followed the announcement of the evening's record-breaking charitable contributions lasted longer than anyone expected. Yet those clapping hands were not celebrating wealth alone. They were celebrating something far more enduring. Across the ballroom, Ivy looked up. Her eyes met Ronan's. Neither of them spoke. Words had become unnecessary long ago. Their quiet smiles carried everything they had built together, respect that had grown into trust. Trust that had become love. And love that had never asked either of them to become someone different. Ronan crossed the room and gently took her hand. Not as a billionaire standing beside the director of his foundation. Not as the former master of the estate beside a woman who had once worn a maid's uniform. Simply as one person grateful to walk through life beside another, around them. The celebration continued. But for a brief moment, the noise faded into the background. The chandeliers still sparkled. The orchestra continued to play. Guests continued talking. Yet the true beauty of the evening no longer came from crystal glasses. Expensive gowns. Or grande architecture. It came from the people. From employees who no longer feared making mistakes. From leaders who chose encouragement over intimidation. From a workplace where dignity was offered freely instead of earned through status. As the final donations were announced and the last round of applause echoed beneath the high ceilings of Blackwood Estate, everyone present carried home more than memories of another successful charity gala. They carried a lesson that would remain with them long after the music had ended. True strength is never measured by how much power someone possesses. True leadership is never built upon fear or authority. It is built one act of kindness at a time, because kindness has the extraordinary power to restore hope. Transform an organization, heal wounded hearts, and change the course of countless lives, including those who never realized they were waiting for someone brave enough to lead with compassion.